Back in Server Manager, I'm going to go to Tools. Under Tools, I'm going to open Dhcp. At this point, the Dhcp service is installed, but no settings have been configured in it yet. So I'm going to resize the window here. Under my Dhcp server, I have IPv4. This is where I will create the new scope for my IP version 4 addresses. I'm going to simply right-click IPv4, and there is an option for New Scope. In this New Scope window, I'm going to select Next. The first question is, what do I want to name the scope? That name is a non-technical name. This is simply an identifier for us, so this makes sense to anyone that looks at DHCP. Often these will be named after locations. If these addresses are for a certain department, they may be named after a department. I'm going to just name this Boston. We'll click Next for that. The range of IP addresses that I intend to lease. I'm going to enter a start IP address of 172.16.0.50. I'm going to enter an end IP address of 172.16.0.254. So my DHCP server will lease addresses 172.16.0.50 up through .254 in that last octet, or that last number in the IP address. If I were on a network that used a custom subnet mask, meaning the network had been subnetted, I would enter whatever the subnet mask is that the network actually uses. Here we are assuming that we are on a default subnet, so I will leave the subnet mask as it is. I'll choose Next for that. Now it prompts me to enter an exclusion. Well, let's say the IP address 172.16.0.100. I know that IP address needs to be assigned statically to some device on the network. I never want DHCP to lease that IP address. I could simply click Add right now, and it would exclude that one address. If I needed to exclude multiple addresses, I could enter those addresses here. Well, that's what we'll do. I'm going to enter the address 172.16.0.110. So now when I add this exclusion, my DHCP server knows it will never lease an address ending in 100 through 110. We will click Next for that. The lease duration always defaults to 8 days. I could set that to minutes, hours, or days, whatever is appropriate for the situation we're actually on. Something you may notice, if you go to a coffee shop, a restaurant, Starbucks, even a hotel, you may notice that you have very short lease durations on those types of networks. The assumption is if you are at a coffee shop that you may be 30 minutes, an hour, probably at most an hour normally. So they do not want to lease you an IP address for a given number of days because they assume you're not on the network that often, and it's unlikely that you return to that network every single day. If I'm in a corporate environment within the enterprise, I may have a longer duration set because I assume you will be on the network for a given number of days. One of the advantages of having a longer lease duration, my default is 8 days. As long as my computer is on the network at least once every 8 days, it will renew its address. But when it renews the address, it retains the same IP address. My client could have the same IP address for months, even years, because before that address expires, it simply renews the address it already has. I have an 8-day lease duration right now. When that lease is 50% expired, my client automatically renews its existing IP address. If for some reason that were to fail, if the DHCP server were to be off the network at that time, the client would attempt to renew its address again at 87.5%. So as long as I'm not off the network for more than 8 days, my clients are going to keep the same IP address. That's why they have it set to 8 days. Again, adjust that to whatever we believe is appropriate for the environment that we're in. I'm going to choose Next for that. This Configure DHCP options. I could say, yes, I want to do this now, or I could say, no, I want to come back and do those later. At some point, you would have to define those, so we will just define these now. If I were to stop right now, the only things I've defined have been the IP address range, the subnet mask, the lease duration, and the exclusion. At this point, you will not have a default gateway, you will not have DNS servers, so you would be unable to connect to any other devices. I want to leave yes selected here, and I'm going to choose Next. The first question is, what would I like the default gateway to actually be? That's going to be the router on our network that connects us to the internet, connects us to other subnets. I'm going to enter the address 172.16.0.1 as my default gateway. I'm going to select Add for that. Next. The machine I'm on is already a DNS server, so it already has a DNS server address added in. I'm going to add in a second DNS server, 172.16.0.11. When I select Add, one of the most unique things about this, it says validating if DNS service is running on this IP address that I typed in. That machine is not a DNS server because I want you to see something. This is what we want to see. It says that IP address, 172.16.0.11, is not a valid DNS address. Do you still want to add it? Now, normally you would figure out what the problem is. Maybe you typed in the bad IP address. Maybe DNS is not running on that machine. But I'm going to click Yes here. The significance of that pop-up message was letting me know that if you do define this here and you have it deployed out to your clients, it will not be able to resolve names for those clients. That's a huge improvement over older versions of DNS. With this, it detects all these settings as we put them in, and it tells us now that's not going to work because that's an invalid setting. Now, whatever IP address is on top is the primary DNS. Whatever address is on the bottom would be the secondary DNS. It does give me the ability to move these up and down. If I wanted .11 to be the primary DNS, I could move that up in the list. Now that would be the primary DNS. The secondary DNS would be .10. So we can jockey those up and down on the list. Now I'm going to remove that .11 since that's not actually a DNS server, and we're just going to delete it from the list. I also have my DNS suffix, which is my domain name, rts.local. That's defined by default in the list. I will leave that as it is. I'll just choose Next. Normally this screen we do not choose anything. This Dns Servers, the Windows Internet Naming Service, this is a legacy service that was used back in the early days of Windows 2000 and in the Windows NT operating system. Its primary purpose was to resolve net BIOS names to IP addresses. It is highly unlikely any network you go to now would actually use a Win server. So you'll notice here, we can leave all of this blank and just click Next. That's what almost all environments would do. So a rarely used service. When I click Next, I can choose to activate this scope. When I activate this scope and finish, I can now lease IP addresses from this machine. I have the address pool 172.16.0.50 through 254. I can view the exclusion that I created earlier. I can also delete that exclusion if necessary. If we have any address leases, they would be in this list. I can also see the scope options. The scope options contain the default gateway, which is this 003 router we defined, the DNS server, and the DNS domain name. If I had not configured those options at that time, I could come back here and click Configure Options, and I could enter the router. If we scroll down, 006 is the DNS servers. So if I did not define those during the initial creation of the scope, Or if I need to modify those at any time later on, simply come back here and make all of those changes.